Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Livable Communities webinar. Today's webinar is titled, How to Create a Bicycle Safety Action Plan, Planning for Safety. And we will be speaking with Bill Schultheis, Vice President and Senior Engineer with Tool Design Group, and Peter Lagerwey, Senior Seattle Regional Office Director with Tool Design Group. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. And before we get to the main presentation today, Dan Goodman with the Federal Highway Administration is going to speak for a moment about new initiatives from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Dan?
Thank you, James and Peter and Bill, for the opportunity, and thank you all. I just want to spend 1 minute to say a few things about things that are happening at USDOT. But first, my name is Dan Goodman. I'm in the Office of Human Environment, which is in the Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty in the Federal Highway Administration. And I wanted to sort of kick off this web series by reiterating that pedestrian and bicycle safety is one of the Secretary's top priorities. And in case you hadn't heard it at Pro Walk, Pro Bike in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, Secretary Fox announced a pedestrian and bicycle safety initiative. He got several standing ovations, and one of the things he said is that safety is our highest priority, and that commitment is the same regardless of which form of transportation people choose, including walking and biking. So he announced the initiative at the conference, and it's going to include a range of different elements. For example, infrastructure safety, education, vehicle safety, data. It's going to include an emphasis on pedestrian and bicycle assessments, so getting out in the field and looking at the conditions on the ground, and also modal coordination. So I think you'll see FHWA, FTA, NHTSA, and all the different federal agencies working closely together and collaborating around the topic of pedestrian and bicycle safety. So FHWA is actively supporting the initiative, and it aligns with our focus areas. So we will, as we have been over the years, we're focusing on safety. So safety is really our top priority, and that extends to all modes, including walking and biking, obviously. I think you'll see us talking more and more about the concept of connected pedestrian and bicycle networks. So we are really going to be spending a lot of time and energy promoting and documenting that sort of connected physical infrastructure that makes walking and biking a viable transportation choice. We've got a lot moving on the pedestrian and bicycle data side. So as you all probably know, there's a pedestrian and bicycle counting chapter in the traffic monitoring guide, and we're working to update TMAS, which is the database that will receive that walking and biking data. We've also got a big emphasis on equity, and so ladders of opportunity is something that we are talking about quite a bit. We've got a lot moving on that front, and as you all know, there's a big overlap between equity and ladders of opportunity and walking and biking for transportation. So I think that what you'll see from us is that we are committed to providing leadership, guidance, tools, funding, and decision support resources, really to encourage and support walking and biking. And so we see that creating bicycle safety action plans is an effective strategy for improving bike safety, and that's really one of the Secretary's top priorities. So that's all I wanted to do, is to sort of kick off this series by mentioning that and noting that this is one of the Secretary's top priorities. So with that, James, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Pete, were you able to get on the line? All right, we're still until we get Pete, so we're gonna move over to Bill and let Bill take over.
Okay, let me get the screen set up here. Can you verify what you're looking at, James?
I see your screen.
Yeah, let's get it started. Okay, well, this was going to be a partnership presentation with Peter and I. This is Bill Schultheis, but I think given the technical difficulties and to make sure that everyone's getting the webinar they anticipated, I'm going to go ahead and just deliver the full presentation. You still looking at my screen?
I am. And if you want to go into slideshow mode, that'd be great.
Sorry, there was a hiccup there. Okay. So again, I'm Bill Schulteis, the Tool Design Group. Peter, my colleague, helped me put this presentation together. But the purpose of this is to talk about how to create a bicycle safety action plan. The key outcome of this series of webinars, and this is the first of 3 that we'll be delivering this month, is to help you understand and recognize what a bicycle-friendly network of roads and trails looks like and how it relates to bicyclist safety. It's to help you all understand how planners and engineers have worked together to address safety concerns. And its other key feature of this webinar series is to help you recognize that there's a pretty diverse set of people that ride bicyclists, that they all have a wide range of skills and tolerance for the traffic environment. And lastly, we want to be able to help you understand good practices and effective solutions that address bicycle safety concerns. As we mentioned, this is the first of 3 webinars. Today, October 2nd, is the first webinar, Planning for Bicycle Safety. So we're just going to be giving you an overview on how to approach planning, taking in data to make some preliminary decisions about improving and tackling the safety problem. But we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds on the next 2 webinars. Webinar number 2 is going to cover on-road bicycle facilities. That'll be on October 16th. And webinar number 3 will focus on trail facilities and off-road facilities and as they transition to the roadway on October 30th. So hopefully you can continue to participate in this webinar series. I'm going to cover some basics about bicycling. Number 1 is, who are we designing for? This picture kind of sums it up. We've got a pretty diverse set of users out there. We've got the more traditional person that people think about when they talk about bicyclists is the bicycle racer, which you can obviously see it on the left. But in reality, the people that we're really looking to design for is it's just your average person who's using a bicycle for transportation. As we see this this wonderful lady here riding her bike, loaded up with gear. So it's really important when you're thinking about safety to understand who we're trying to address the safety issue with. You hear a lot of discussion these days about designing for 8 to 80, and what does that mean? 8 is the idea of children, thinking about children riding in the bicycle system, whether it's on trails, on streets, on sidewalks, all the way up to seniors. That we're trying to develop a transportation system that serves that range of people. They vary in experience from being very confident and having received formal training in how to ride a bicycle, how to operate in traffic, to those folks that are a little less confident, maybe a little more casual in their riding style, a lot slower, who maybe haven't received any formal training. These different types of users have very different expectations for their interaction with traffic and types of facilities that they prefer. The City of Portland had done some research a number of years ago, and they were able to drill down into these different types of cyclists a little bit further. And they basically broke it up into 4 categories. On the left, you kind of have very confident cyclists who will ride in any condition, and whether it be weather or traffic conditions. And then we have a larger segment of the population that's very excited and confident cyclists. But the target demographic that you hear a lot about in planning for bicycling is the interested but concerned population. What the City of Portland found is that about 60% of their residents through surveys expressed concerns with traffic safety, sharing streets with traffic, and their preference was to have some separation from traffic, in particular as traffic volumes got high or traffic speeds got higher. Through the research, the City of Portland found that if we could develop facilities that address those concerns, that a large percentage of their city population would be very interested in cycling for transportation. And lastly, this lady's enjoying her love bug here. There's a certain amount of people that can't ride bicycles, won't ride bicycles, whether it be for personal reasons or health reasons. But it's generally found that that population percentage was relatively small. The AASHTO guide took this research, updated it, and broke it down a little bit into two smaller groups. Kind of simplified this approach. We have more of the experienced, confident cyclists on the left, and then we have the casual and less confident cyclists on the right. The AASHTO guide is a good resource for looking at different types of bicycles, but increasingly we're getting a wider variety of vehicles on the roadway system. Some of this is coming over from European experiences, and I think a lot of this is really being driven by just the explosion of interest in using cycling for various trip purposes. From transportation to using it as a shuttle bus for children to get to school or daycare, to even shopping. And these bicycles you see here in the photographs illustrate the very different types of bicycles. And it's important for designers to understand when they're thinking about safety and designing facilities, what types of bicycles and vehicles and trailers might you have to deal with, because they all have very different size and operating criteria. The AASHTO guide gives a bit of an overview on some of these dimensions, and there's many more besides, many more types of bicycles than even what's shown in this guide, because again, this is I think it's a very fascinating part of the field today, that there's a lot of very interesting types of bicycles being invented and put out into the roadway. The AASHTO guide also talks, as you can see here, and gives some overview and description on the rider envelope and just the general implications of the size of people on bikes and the operating space that they need to feel comfortable. It's important to be considering the type of trip to a small extent, but generally people take trips for a wide variety of reasons. We don't necessarily design our facilities for a particular type of trip, but it does help inform origins and destinations and locations you may want to focus improvements on if you're seeing a safety problem somewhere. It's broken out into two categories generally of sort of this non-discretionary trips, that people that need to get somewhere to a job or to work, versus discretionary trips which are more oriented around recreation. Generally people, when they're taking a non-discretionary trip, are trying to take the shortest route and minimize the amount of time, so the fastest, shortest path, whereas recreational riders may be willing or interested in taking a more leisurely route, and it may not be as direct. Another important consideration as a baseline is just understanding the movements bicyclists make when they're operating in a roadway environment. The AASHTO guide graphic I show here on the screen illustrates three different sort of strategies people may take to execute a left turn from the street. The one strategy that is increasingly being utilized by more and more people is this one here on the right side of the screen, which is a box left turn, where a cyclist actually goes through the intersection all the way across and stops, and then on the change of the traffic light proceeds in the other direction with traffic. Next, I'm going to just give a very brief overview of the different types of the more typical bike facilities that you would be considering as you're developing a safety action plan. The most prolific and the most common, and I think generally will continue to be a very, very common bicycle facility, is what we like to say is the humble bicycle lane. It's very effective at creating a separate space on the roadway for bicyclists to be able to travel at their own speed with some margin with comfort of being separated out from the through moving traffic on the left. Generally, Bicycle lanes are typically on the right-hand side of the road, and generally bicyclists, as a slower moving vehicle, operate on the right side of the road. But sometimes these facilities are actually installed on the left-hand side of the road, and that's okay, but it may be something to be aware of if you're looking at a particular crash situation where you're seeing bikes involved with crashes, and maybe there's a relationship to whether they're on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. So it's just something to be aware of, that bicyclists are not required to always be on the right side of the road. And in fact, there may be circumstances where it's safer for bicyclists to be on the left side of the road, if, as in this photo, it's to avoid riding adjacent to parked vehicles. Maybe it's to avoid having to interact a lot with stopping and starting buses on a heavy bus route. Trails are another very common facility type, and probably the most popular with the wide percentage of the public, and they're most popular because they have total separation from traffic. A challenge is that often they are shared with pedestrians, and you can get into situations or safety challenges where you have bicyclists and pedestrians interacting, or even in some cases crashing into each other. A newer type of facility in the United States, the last 6 years or so, 7 years, is separated bike lanes. These have also been called cycle tracks or protected bike lanes. They basically take the trail concept onto the street and improve upon it by separating bicyclists from pedestrians. So now bicyclists are separate from moving traffic and also separate from pedestrians. So it's a more comfortable environment for all three modes to operate. There's a lot of different devices used to separate, from flex posts that you can see in this photograph, parked cars, but some cities are starting now to spend a little bit more money and actually install curb islands to make it more permanent separation. Another type of facility is a bike boulevard. This is a great graphic from the AASHTO guide. And a bike boulevard is a little bit branding, but it's basically a local low-volume street that is calm traffic. Generally, traffic speeds are 15 to 25 miles an hour. And there's usually a series of traffic calming devices to enforce that speed. So this graphic gives you a nice overview of a combination of these features. Bike boulevards are designed to try to minimize bicyclists having to stop. So really good bike boulevards remove stop signs and have them oriented to the side streets so that they can become very efficient travel options for bicyclists. Well, we can talk in the next two webinars. We'll get a little bit more into the details on facility types, but for the rest of the webinar, we're going to really focus on planning. So why plan accommodations for bicycling? Probably very importantly, as bicycling is increasingly very popular, it's on the rise. It's a very convenient, fast, and efficient mode of travel for shorter trips that are 2 to 3 miles. But they also have the side benefits of being just fun, very healthy, can help people improve upon their health. If they're busy with their jobs and don't have a lot of extra time to exercise, they can incorporate that into their work trip. And they also are a very critical mobility option for people who actually can't drive because they don't have a license or choose not to have a driver's license. Bicycle planning is also really important for society. Again, the health aspect can't be understated. We have an obesity epidemic in the United States, and to the extent that people can incorporate exercise into their normal daily life activities, it can help address that. Bicycling is certainly a key, plays a very important role in that. Bicycling also helps reduce transportation-related energy costs. Obviously, it's a clean vehicle. It doesn't emit anything pollution-wise, and has obviously a lot of benefits from helping to reduce traffic congestion. And speaking to that, this is a great billboard that, if you're, people tend to think when they're in a car, they're stuck in traffic, and they don't think of themselves as being part of the traffic. So there's very interesting marketing campaigns now trying to help people make that linkage between their choices and how it affects their transportation options. Bicycling can be a lot cheaper for citizens living in cities. It can be cheaper than transit. It's certainly cheaper than driving when you factor in the cost of time to park and pay to park a vehicle, or sometimes the cost of having to take transit long distances, or have to transfer multiple times and pay the fees each time. And lastly, bicycling is really a social activity, and it helps bring and build community together. As Dan mentioned at the very beginning, it has been for a long time federal policy to consider bicycling in all federally funded transportation projects. But as he mentioned at the beginning of the call this September, they're increasingly going to take a broader view and focus of this, of trying to focus to address the safety challenges, of really focusing on building interconnected networks. And it's interesting that their focus too is on trying to make sure that these networks work for people of all ages and abilities, and that speaks to the 8 to 80 interested but concerned folks that I described earlier. You can get more information about this policy on their website, as it was just recently announced. This is a great overview document. Lastly, the idea of why plan, it's really important for safety. I think you can look at this picture and realize that at a number of levels it's not comfortable for that bicyclist to be out in that type of traffic. And it's potentially not safe to the standpoint that it can be hard to see a bicyclist when you're intermixed with that kind of volume of traffic. So, why should we accommodate them? Cyclists are legal road users. They certainly have the right to travel on all roadways, but a little bit more differently than motorists being in a protected vehicle, cyclists are vulnerable road users. While a pedestrian is certainly a vulnerable road user, their exposure time is limited to the crossing of the street, where the bicyclist out in the shared roadway environment such as this is continuously exposed to traffic and all the interactions that comes with. Clearly, when you start to see communities around the country that have invested in cycling, such as Portland, with networks, and now they have more of a connected network, you see that they're getting larger and larger numbers of cyclists, and that cyclists are starting to feel that they are part of that transportation environment and are safe operating in that transportation environment. There's an aspect to bicycling that people have concerns about liability, but a solid planning effort reduces your liability. Ignoring problems that are out there, you have this photograph of a bike lane that ends and directs you into a sidewalk so that they can develop a right turn lane at this particular community. That's not safe. Ignoring that, not addressing that, is not helping you protect yourself from liability. There's a number of resources on this liability topic, but there's a very good one that the Federal Highway Administration put together on tort liability and risk management in July 2006. So if you have any concerns about the liability aspects, we'd encourage you to look at this resource document. But a main point here is that it's really no longer acceptable to not consider bicyclists and pedestrians in any safety project or any transportation project generally. Lastly, and probably more importantly, is communities are competing with each other for residents, for workers. There's an aspect of economic competitiveness here that accommodating for cycling is a really important strategy for cities to compete for jobs, to compete for talent. You're seeing more and more mayors coming out and saying that they want to be the most bicycle-friendly city in the United States. The League of American Cyclists has done a great job with their community ranking series, which I think has helped foster a little bit of that competitiveness. But at the end of the day, the general public recognizes a healthy, livable community as a desirable place to live, and often those communities have cycling as a very big element of their community. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the bicycle safety problem now. So what are we dealing with when it comes to safety of bicyclists? In 2012 alone, over 700 cyclists were killed in the transportation system and over 49,000 injured. While cyclists account for 2% of all traffic deaths and injuries, they generally only represent about 1% of traffic. So bicyclists are overrepresented in crash statistics. It's what we're seeing when you look at the data that's published by NHTSA. So if you're looking for a good place to get some of this data, I would suggest you go to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration website, because they have reports that they generate every year on crashes for all modes. So looking through that resource, what we found between 2002 and 2012 is that generally fatalities for all modes of transportation have been declining, which is great, and I think it shows that there has been an emphasis on improving the safety of our transportation environment. However, when it comes to bicyclist fatalities, they've really flatlined, and in fact, since 2009, have been increasing steadily every year, and that's why I think, again, Dan mentioned earlier, this is a focus area for the Secretary and for Federal Highway Administration moving forward, is to try to reduce these rates of bicyclist fatalities. Generally, about 69% of these crashes are occurring in urban areas, and another aspect you can get from this data is targeting, what times a day should you be thinking about these improvements and what's going on. We find half the crashes, over 50%, are generally at night between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. As it gets darker. Likewise, injuries. Injuries have been on the decline now steadily for all modes with a slight uptick from 11 to 12. But again, from the standpoint of bicycling, they have not been decreasing. It's been holding pretty steady. 31% of injuries occur at non-intersections, but flipping that around, intersections are probably the most important place to be looking at to address crash improvements to reduce injuries for cyclists. So a quick overview on planning for safety. There's a wide range of planning activities that you can undertake, from large-scale, area-wide master plans that may be multimodal, to mode-specific bicycle master plans. You can be looking at transportation corridor studies, small area plans. Any of these and all of these are appropriate vehicles to be considering safety. Generally, when you're doing a master plan at a regional level, you'll be looking for trends like I just talked about from the NHTSA level, but you take it down to the city level or the regional level and understand what your most typical crash types are that your community has dealing with. When you take it down to the corridor level, you can start to understand particular causes of crashes as they relate to roadway operations or geometry or particular behaviors. Typical components of a bike master plan that might address safety. Often when you do a visioning exercise or goals and objectives, you're going to be laying out strategies, and a very common strategy in a bike master plan is to improve safety while simultaneously increasing rates of cycling. There's usually a robust public processes, and what we hear a lot when we're doing master plans is the general public has a lot of concerns about safety of bicycling on the transportation system, and they're seeking improvements. And then you utilize the traditional 5E strategy of engineering, education, encouragement, enforcement, evaluation. You can structure plans in different ways around those 5Es, but generally each one of those can have a very important contribution to helping you improve safety in your community. As Dan mentioned, a connected network is really a great strategy because at the end of the day, bicyclists are legal operators on all streets. And so we're looking to do, when we're doing a master plan, is to figure out what's the best accommodation on all of the streets. And often what you end up evolving to is a hierarchy of different levels of accommodation that themselves form sub-networks. So you may have a network of bicycle lanes. You'd ideally like them to all be connected to each other. A network of trails, maybe a network of low-volume local streets that you may turn into bicycle boulevards. But those are just some examples. You should be trying to address barriers and intersections, and very importantly, connecting to neighboring jurisdictions so that there's good connectivity within your community and external to your neighbors. Walking you through how this plan's generally set up is you would start with getting a good assessment of existing conditions. Again, that's where you may look at your local crash history, get some reports where traffic counts are available for automobiles, get a sense of what streets are the higher volume streets that cyclists would like to have a higher degree of comfort operating on, which would mean a higher level of separation from traffic. Or there may even be streets that you prefer to avoid and have parallel lower volume streets as alternatives. These are just a few of the factors that you'd be thinking about considering as you're looking through this. Another aspect to help you in planning out where to make improvements and ultimately at the end of the planning process, how to prioritize which improvements should be implemented first to address your safety issues is you could do a demand analysis. Typical features and aspects of demand analysis is considering land use. It's really important. But in some cities you may be considering terrain. You'd be wanting to understand origin and destinations of bicyclists that they prefer. And then, what are major barriers that you need to overcome? It could be rivers, railroads, interstates. Those are all very common barriers. And when you have a series of barriers like that, they can become focal points for safety concerns because you get high intense traffic occurring and crossing only at limited bridge crossings of a railroad, for example, where everyone's funneling together, and so those can be places that you would look to. You may potentially have a safety problem that you would like to address. Another aspect that you can do is crash data analysis. You can really be looking for trends. Now, generally speaking, bicycle and even pedestrian crashes are scattered. It can be hard to have clear patterns, and because they don't happen at a city level, you're not going to be having them happening at the same frequency as automobile crashes. So that they may look a little more random, but when you piece them together and look at them over a period of time, and generally it's good to look at bike crash data over a period of 5 or 10 years worth. When you look at that type of range of number of years, you can then start to see some patterns. This is just an example on the screen where particular corridors might pop up as the places where higher percentages of crashes are occurring in your community. So those would be locations you would want to target in your bike planning efforts to see what types of improvements you could do to improve safety. One thing that you really need to understand, again, as I mentioned, that crashes are usually kind of dispersed, is that, number one, crash data doesn't account for near misses. And again, through dialogue with the public, you'll come to understand that people have many, many more near misses than they do an actual crash. And you may even have intersections that don't have any crashes but have very frequent quantity of near misses. And so when you go out and are talking with the public, they would say that that is a location that needs improvement. So it's always very important to balance looking at crash data with public input. This is an example from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's a lot of public input into locations of concern for safety, and it helped visualize corridors to have to focus on for potential safety improvements or bike lane infrastructure improvements. And once you get out and start looking at what type of improvements to make when you're looking at the ground. You can be looking for clues. This is a person that you can see here. Now there's a bicycle lane, but the person's riding on the sidewalk. Why is that? To that person, it's likely not a comfortable environment to be riding on that roadway. It's a pretty wide road. They have very high-speed traffic, even if it's a posted lower speed. As you can see in the photograph, that the gutter is about 2 feet wide, and the bike lane asphalt portion is about 2 feet wide, and there's the gutter seen right in the middle. So to the cyclist, this is not really a facility that is appealing to them, and so they've chosen to ride on the sidewalk. So these are an example of the types of things you might be looking at. Other factors here, obviously, are, again, looking at the overall spacing of bikeway networks relative to each other. Is this the only option a person might have in a corridor? So you should spend a little more time to try to improve a facility to make it work. Once you've got a handle on the types of crashes and the types of corridor challenges you're facing and the different geometries or operational areas, intersection operations that you need to tackle to improve bike safety, a great resource for you is the pedbikesafe.org. It's got a whole website dedicated to potential countermeasures. It's a great place to educate yourself on different techniques and mitigation strategies to offset and correct certain types of crashes or certain types of behaviors. When it comes to choosing, I think there's quite an increasingly diverse range of bike facilities that are available in treatments, from traffic calming, shared streets, all the way to fully separated cycle tracks and trails. But the main thing that is really important when you're thinking about that is your relationship to your available space, the strategy that you can implement, that you can utilize to get more space, whether you're in a situation where you can remove parking or remove a travel lane to create more space. What is your budget? Can you really reconstruct a roadway to add a trail, or do you have lesser money available, in which case you can only do some restriping and maybe add a bicycle lane? But increasingly there's a relationship that's been discovered of relating traffic stress, that feeling that a person feels riding in a shared environment with motorists, to their separation. And so this is something that you should get familiar with, is the concept of bicycle level of service, which you can find in the highway capacity manual, and also this concept of level of traffic stress and how that relates to an individual's preference for a certain type of bike facility in different traffic environments. The AASHTO guide also provides a little bit of guidance based on different types of users and then what they might like as far as facilities. It's just one example from the guide. But it talks about the appropriateness of bike lanes and under what conditions you might apply them to your network. Once you've assessed your crashes, or you've got a sense at a location of what the more common crash types are, what you'll find is that these types of crashes generally can rise up to the top. This data comes from looking at the NHTSA data, but these are the most common actual crashes nationwide that you'll find a bicyclist getting into an accident. Number one is wrong way riding, whether that be on a sidewalk or on the street. That's typically a very, very prominent source of crashes in the community. Sidewalk riding is often number two. Dooring is a crash where a motorist gets out of a parked car and strikes a bicyclist riding adjacent to them. That crash can be more prevalent in cities that are very dense with a lot of on-street parking. Bicyclists being struck from behind is not an uncommon crash. They tend to be more fatal in suburban, rural areas where traffic speeds are higher. And lastly, another very common type of crash is just bicyclists or motorists failing to yield. They're all in the proper place, but they're just failing to follow traffic control devices or to follow the standard right-of-way rules at an intersection. So I'm going to give you a few examples, and this is kind of a teaser for the next few webinars so we can get a little bit more into detail on it. But how would you address, deal with a safety issue? So say in your community, wrong way riding is a prevalent cause of crashes. Well, all of these facilities are potential solutions, from bicycle lanes, which would encourage bicyclists by giving them their own separate space on the roadway to come off of sidewalks, feel more comfortable riding the street. They've been proven to help reduce wrong way riding. A newer innovation is, the cycle track or protected bike lane. This is a great example, City of Denver, where they had a one-way street, but they had a lot of cyclists riding the wrong way up the one-way street because there were challenges with their downtown street connectivity. So instead of trying to ticket everybody and cause them to have to go a long way out of their way, what they did is they actually repurposed a portion of the sidewalk and created this off-street separated cycle track. It's a very slick solution to deal with wrong way riding. So they legitimized it because they were meeting a need, and there was a high demand for this movement because it created a very direct connection between two important links in their bikeway system. So that's another example type of solution. And lastly, another one, a simple one, is shared lane markings. Shared lane markings are not as effective as the other treatments from pulling people off sidewalks because you're still sharing the road with traffic, but they still have shown some great benefits in getting people to ride with traffic and to take a stronger position in the roadway relative to traffic. This is, again, an example project, City of Boston, where they were reconstructing a bridge, and it was a very popular system of side paths on the bridges, and they had to close them down. So during the construction, they installed bicycles may use full lane signs and a large quantity of shared lane markings in the roadway to really emphasize to all the users out there that bicyclists belonged in the road and should be out in the road to operate safely. So again, we'll talk a little bit more detail in the next two webinars about other treatments on road and off road to improve safety. But to kind of wrap up our webinar today, just wanted to touch on a few last aspects of the planning process. Obviously, education and enforcement are key components of any planning process. They can help address some behaviors. And again, looking at the NHTSA data, these are three very prominent causes of crashes or contributing factors in crashes. 31% of injuries occurring between 6 p.m. 6 a.m., being dark, being not visible. So developing programs and education strategies that orient people around being visible, wearing brighter clothing, or making sure they have lights on their bicycles and reflectors can help address that type of crash. Dealing with alcohol, same as motorists, there's a prevalence of fatal bicycle crashes being associated with alcohol drinking. So making sure through your marketing campaigns that sometimes there can be a belief that it's okay to drink and ride. It's not as dangerous as drinking and driving. So having some very slick marketing campaigns around that to help people understand that they can be equally as dangerous. And lastly, school children. Children under 16, again, high incidences of younger children who aren't as experienced or comfortable getting into crashes. So having programs in the school system that teach them how to ride safely, training programs with your local advocacy groups, very successful ways of dealing with that type of crash. At the end of your plan, obviously you want to plan for implementation. You actually want to get these improvements on the ground. I'd mentioned earlier the idea of thinking about your budgets. Can you reconstruct the road, or can you just do a simple restriping? Maybe you're going to phase in an improvement project over time. Those are very smart strategies to improve safety in the environment. Thinking about your funding mechanisms. We see a lot of clients where they have very silo-oriented funding, so it's being aware of those funding structures to try to make sure that throughout your organization that you are pooling money and being strategic and getting these projects implemented as best you can. Lastly, the most important thing is obviously coordination of partner agencies, whether it's a transit authority, an adjoining jurisdiction, or it could be your own school district or a parks department, working together to make sure trails are maintained so that we don't have crashes occurring because of a lack of maintenance, that we keep our striping refreshed, or if it's you're in a colder climate, that our bike lanes and sidewalks and trails are cleared of snow. So that's going to wrap up the presentation. Just again, wanted to remind you that we have the next webinar on October 16th, where we're going to talk a little bit more details about on-road bike facilities and how they relate to improving safety. And then we'll conclude this series on October 30th with off-road facilities. So James, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. Pete, I believe we have you on the line now?
I'm here.
Great. And Dan, are you still on the line? All right, I don't think Dan's on the line. Before we get to questions, I wanted to go over a couple quick things. The presentation slides will be available for download at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars under the BSAP webinar series. Also, there was some confusion about the start time of the webinar today. This webinar and the remaining two webinars will be running from 2 to 3:30. I know the reminder that GoToWebinar sent out sent 1:30 to 4. That is incorrect, and I am sorry for the confusion. We will be going from 2 to 3:30 for the rest of this series. So if you have not already done so, please enter your questions in the question box, and we'll get started with questions now. The first question is, can you offer any suggestions where an off-road bike ped path crosses a 35 mile/hour speed limit road? Should you have a ped-activated flashing light, a bridge, or a tunnel?
Sure. That's not an uncommon type of trail crossing. I mean, in that situation, there's some more context, obviously, that would help answer the question. But if it's a multi-lane road, the best strategy is to have a refuge island out there. Number one, because that's shown really good crash reduction ability for both pedestrians and cyclists. Another consideration would be the volume of traffic. Are there gaps? If there's not gaps in traffic, you may want to add an activated device. It could be a rapid flashing beacon, which is allowed to be installed at trail crossings. Or maybe if the traffic is so intense, you may even have to elevate it up to a signalized crossing. But generally, when it comes to the idea of bridges and tunnels in lieu of an at-grade, there's a lot that you have to understand about the context of your environment. If you're in an environment where it's along maybe more suburban or rural, or your land uses in the terrain support a tunnel or something between land uses that makes sense and that people would use it. But if you have a lot of destinations that are street level, people won't go out of their way to use a bridge or a tunnel, and they may continue to cross at grade.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Pete.
Oh, I was just going to add one other comment. Earlier, Bill covered the design bicycle, and that's also something to really consider when you're designing like a refuge island or a crossing island. A lot of tandems nowadays, a lot of trailers, and being able to fit in that crossing becomes more of an issue on a trail crossing, especially if it's a busy trail.
All right, great. Thank you. The next question is, can you define or better explain what a climbing lane is?
Sure, and we'll get into this in the next webinar with some examples. But it's basically if you've got a street with a grade, moderate to steep grade, a climb lane is a bicycle lane that is positioned for bicyclists going uphill, and you may, in the downhill direction, not have a bicycle lane. It could be a shared lane marking.
All right. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with the backlash when adding bike facilities requires removing on-street parking?
Yeah. Let's weigh in on that, and I can follow up.
Yeah, that's a really, really tough one. And you know, when I work, you know, in a community and we're looking at the different options, usually do not start with that as your first project, if you will. And you know, I just wouldn't start there. So that's the first comment in terms of what you do first, second, and third. You sort of need to you know, earn permission, if you will, to take some of that space because, again, it's a very sensitive issue. And then the next step beyond that, when you do a street where you're going to start looking at some parking, I think it's really important to do a complete and thorough parking study and finding out, you know, is it perceived demand? Is it really demand? You know, what's the use? And then the other thing is to look at what kind of use is there. Not all parking is equal. Is this parking that's really vital for adjacent businesses in terms of their vitality? Is it free parking that's being just filled up by you know, people who work in the area and they're getting free on-street parking? Is it a residential area where there are no off-street parking options in terms of driveways, or are those options there? And then really looking at, are there, once you understand what kind of parking is there, are there other, you know, can you substitute the parking? Are there side streets? Are there places that you can make the parking available? So it really takes some, I think, thorough study, being really transparent about what you're looking at, what the numbers are showing, and then using that to start having the conversation.
All right, thank you. Can you better explain or provide more information about how Portland determined its breakdown of cyclists in the community? And is that methodology available to other municipalities?
Yes, they had done a telephone survey of a random sample, I believe, of their residents. So they're able to validate that. I think they got some support from the university. I believe initially Roger Geller was one of the principals behind it, working for the city. I think they kind of just learned through public meetings and interactions, and they kind of ascertained and guessed at the percentages. But when they actually brought the researchers on board and they did the survey and they reached out to the community, they pretty much verified his initial impressions of that. So I think what we can do in the next webinar is put that resource into that research study onto that. But I believe it was from either Berkeley or Portland State. It was one of those two where the research universities that were involved in that.
All right, thank you. People often argue that there's no one riding bikes in their area as a reason to not build protected bike lanes. How do you respond?
I would suggest a couple things. One is that it means that you really need to be careful in a community about the first ones you put in. You really want to put them in places that are going to get used. The other thing that you really want to focus on, and Bill covered this, is connectivity. A lot of times you can have a wonderful facility, but if it's kind of an orphan and it doesn't connect well, it could be the reason that it's not used a lot. And so I think it really gets back to the planning process and then the prioritization process of really focusing on those connections. You know, they're going to get a lot of use. And of course, one thing we know is that the more facilities you build and the more connected it is, the more use you're going to get.
It's really good. And another thing is we recommend a lot to clients, and it's a hard one sometimes. If you're going to build a new facility if you're in a community that's never had a bike lane before, or if you're in a community that's never had a cycle track, and you're going to go do it for the first time, the first one's got to be really good. You got to pick a street where you know there's some demand already there, some latent demand built in, and it may not be just the easiest street to restripe. You want that first project to be a real win for everybody to get excited about and not become a vehicle for people to criticize. So that's something to be thinking about.
All right, thank you. Is there a standard method or protocol or process for crash analysis? This particular community has plenty of data.
We've been doing some crash analysis recently for some cities. There's not a hard and fast protocol when it comes to reviewing bike crashes. As I mentioned before, they're pretty dispersed in a community. So you're going to look at a number of years of data to get it together. Well, what we find in looking through these police reports, there's two levels. There's looking at the police crash report, and then there's looking at summaries. And a lot of communities only have sort of the summaries. It's really important to look at the police crash reports and read them, because what we often find is there's a good many errors associated with the translation from the police crash report to the summary reports that can be problematic in trying to determine fault or contributing factors in a crash. There also tends to be variability in different police organizations' reporting forms. So again, I would suggest, as far as looking at a good best practice, UNC Highway Safety Research Center has got a good program for crash reporting. The Ped Bike Info, it's got some good stuff. It's a good place to start to get an understanding of what goes into assessing crash reports and then how crashes are typed.
I would just add a couple thoughts to that. The way crashes present themselves, obviously is very different for bicycle crashes than for motor vehicle crashes, and they tend not to be as focused at a intersection as much, and as Bill said, dispersed. But quite often they will focus along a particular corridor. And so if they do that, it starts to suggest that maybe there's a corridor solution to the whole thing. And then secondly, I'd also just make another plug for Bike Safe. One of the things you can do in looking at the police reports and looking at the typologies and the kind of crashes, as Bill was suggesting, is you may see some patterns in terms of sort of the situation that it occurs in. And so it may well be that there's a universal countermeasure, maybe more than one, that you want to, say, apply to your whole jurisdiction. And so one of the things that you'll find in Bike Safe is you look for a pattern of a certain kind of crash, and then it's going to suggest countermeasures to address that type of crash. And so that can also be a very, very good way to go.
All right, thank you. Some communities previously had adequate connecting corridors on adequate shoulders, but those shoulders are being cut by putting the installation of rumble strips in response to federal safety initiatives that pays for these rumble strips. Is there anything being done to stop rumbling in places where it adversely affects cyclist safety and offers little safety benefit to motorists?
I'll start with that one, and then Bill,
sure.
why don't you chime in? But if you look at the new 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide, what it suggests there, it doesn't say don't use those kinds of rumble strips, but it suggests that you start putting them on the white edge line, and so that it doesn't intrude as much into the space where typically you'd be riding on a shoulder, and it also calls for some gaps where you can go in and out of that area. Bill, you might want to add on to that.
Yeah, we've also discovered that through a number of projects working with state DOTs that rumble strips clearly have a safety benefit to help reduce run-off-the-road crashes for motorists. And so they're going to be continued to be used widespread manner by DOTs throughout the United States. But the one thing we've discovered in working with state DOTs is that a good many of them adopted a rumble strip design standard from a design that was developed about 15 or 20 years ago when there was really no consideration of bicyclists at that point in time. And there's been a lot of experimentation on different rumble strip designs that maintain their effectiveness to prevent run-off-the-road crashes but are not as big and not as disruptive to bicyclists. And so increasingly, I think you're going to start to see some more information, and we'll present examples of that at the upcoming webinars.
All right. Going back to the Portland crash reports, do you know if during crashes were included in that, as that's not a major problem in some other cities in America?
That was not, that data was not from the city of Portland. That was nationwide, so that's from the NHTSA database. But like I said when I was talking about during, it is a crash that tends to be about 5 to 10% is a number we see a lot in very urban cities like Boston or New York City or Toronto. And it's less of a high percentage in smaller communities or communities that don't have as much parking demand.
All right. Can you offer any suggestions for getting city street engineers to focus on multiple uses when they're doing their planning?
That's a tough one because you're changing sort of hearts and minds, and I think it really gets back to a lot of things that were covered in the webinar in terms of looking at the federal directives. Most states now have very good directives. More and more communities are having bike master plans, or at least it's part of a transportation plan, and using that policy to bring the conversation to the table. I also thought what Bill presented on liability, that alone should inspire one to come to the table. So it's all those things that I think need to be part of the conversation. The one thing we haven't talked a lot about here is just public involvement. And one of the things that we know is that whenever we do surveys and whenever we go to the public, there is a lot of demand and interest in safer and better bike facilities. And figuring out a way to bring that voice to the table as part of the decision making. I think one of the things that we're finding is that most communities are a bit strapped for funds, and if the public's going to provide more funding for transportation, they will want to see that transportation's meeting their needs and providing those kinds of things that allow for more bicycling and walking. So that becomes part of the equation. And what we're seeing is that the agencies that do a good job of listening are also the agencies that very frequently are the ones that are able to generate the resources and the public support to create the kind of transportation networks and systems that give people choices and accommodate all users.
I think Pete hit on some really good points there, and I back it up with when I'm working with fellow engineers, they respond pretty positively to data, to facts, prefer less on the emotional side of the discussion, but if you could present them a factual, fact-based argument for why what you're proposing is a good idea, or why it might improve a situation to be safer or beneficial to the community, you'll have a lot more success. And if you can cite examples, and it's increasingly easier to do that with the internet now and the sharing of information that exists today. That could be very helpful in getting a change of direction on a design or an outcome.
Okay. Next question. And if you do have any more questions, please be sure to enter them in your question box. Are the intersections of two roads with a traffic signal the best place to have a bike path across the street, as opposed to a separate mid-block crossing that might be closer to the trail?
It's another one where the context is really important, so I'll take it two directions. I'll just kind of presuppose a context. So one is a trail that comes up to a signalized intersection. Yeah, that works fine and can be made safe through a number of interventions, but generally that would be, the preference would be to have that trail crossing occur where you would normally expect to see a crosswalk at an intersection, close to the intersection. You know, with signal timing, you could protect the trail crossing, you could restrict left turns to a protected phase, you could hold right turns if there's a separate right turn lane or delay it, providing a leading interval. Those are things that can improve safety. Another context that I see and comes up on and off is a trail that is not approaching and coming into the intersection, but is actually maybe 100 feet away from the intersection. So it's not quite mid-block, and there's a strong temptation to try to require those trail users to deviate and come to the traffic signal to cross. And we generally find that those do not work quite as well, that people will take the shortest path, and to expect people to deviate around is potentially an unreasonable request, depending on the environment. In those situations, you would want to focus some engineering attention on making that mid-block location a safe crossing. Again, we'll speak to some of these issues at the third webinar.
All right. Next question. Going back to one of the graphics you showed that was titled Graphical Representation of LTS Scores. It rated various bicycle facilities in terms of traffic stress. It also included some criteria for selecting those facilities. Was that part of the countermeasure selection system, or is there another source for that graphic and the criteria?
That's a graphic we kind of developed here just for public consumption to help visualize the relationship of traffic stress to a type of facility based on preferences that the public has expressed to us over the years. The resource for level of traffic stress is I Google that in, but it's a Mineta Institute document, which gives you the methodology and background for that project, and how to determine level of traffic stress in your community. But I think, again, as I mentioned there at the time, it's just the idea that we have a lot of research now, from bicycle level of service to the traffic stress, and frankly to the thousands of public meetings that we've all had in our own communities, where the stated preference of the vast majority of the public is they prefer not to be riding in high volumes of traffic or high-speed traffic, and they really enjoy and prefer a more comfortable environment, which tends to lead to a more safe environment where they have their own operating space.
All right. You made a brief mention of snow removal at the very end of the presentation. Is snow ice removal an absolute requirement for all paths and sidewalks maintained by a public agency? And what has been found to be the definition of reasonable efforts in this regard? How have agencies dealt with it?
I'll start. You know, nothing's absolute, so of course not. But I would just direct you to some communities that have done a good job on it and develop policies on it. And I would probably start with Madison, Wisconsin. And they have some good materials. You can look at how they set priorities and what they do. What I would also suggest, too, is that if you go to the League of American Bicyclists and their list of some of, say, the gold and silver communities and the ones that are in northern areas where you get a lot of snow, I would look to some of their policies and use those as models.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's about all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. I'm also sorry for the technical difficulties we had earlier in this webinar. We'll make sure we get those fixed before the next webinars. As a reminder, we will be hosting the next 2 webinars in this series on October 16th and October 30th. They will be covering on-road facilities and then off-road facilities. Those webinars will run from 2 to 3:30 p.m. A PDF copy of the presentation slides is available at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars under the BSAP webinar series. Again, that's at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars under the Bicycle Safety Action Plan webinar series. And a recording of today's program will be posted to that site as well as to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/pedbikeinfo within a couple of weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike for updates. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again to our speakers, Bill Schultheis and Pete Lagerwey. And thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Livable Communities webinar.